So I would like to go back to their synapse and neurotransmitters and tell you how all this that we told you in the previous segment relates to our behavior. It is a psychology class, and now we want to take all this biology and say, and what does it exactly mean to my personal life? So I would like to tell you that neurotransmitters, that in the last few decades we discovered dozens of different neurotransmitters, and I would like just to give you example of two. I'm going to tell you about serotonin. Low level of serotonin, so we're biochemical. First of all, how can you get low level of serotonin? So could it be that you have a genetic predisposition? So maybe it's your mom or your dad, maybe it runs in your family, and you were born in such a way that there's a tendency for you to have low level of serotonin. Could it be, I'm going to give you another example, that you're a little infant and somebody is taking and shaking you, so that vulnerable brain that is under development, so we say that there's a possibility that our life experiences might alter the level of chemicals that we have in our brain. But the bottom line, regardless of what reasons brought us to low level of serotonin, if that's the case, so then people tend to be more depressed. Low level of serotonin has been linked to suicidal tendencies. It's been linked to eating disorders like anorexia and bulimia. And it's also been linked to, I think I said obsessive compulsive disorders, like nail biting, for example, or obsessive like rituals where you maybe wash your hands compulsively. So higher or ability to elevate serotonin from low level to high, so apparently that's going to happen, leads to dominance. And we have those studies to suggest those effects. So that's serotonin. Another example of neurotransmitter is dopamine. So dopamine is a very interesting neurotransmitter because it's responsible for our experience or emotion of joy and happiness. For example, when you're falling in love, both serotonin and especially dopamine is very, very high in our brain. So that's what gives you that sense of euphoria and obsessive compulsive thinking. It is due to high level of dopamine. So you cannot stop thinking about somebody. You try to invite them for the date and your mouth is dry, your hands are sweaty. So there's a lot of biochemistry to our behaviors. What's happened when we are dumped in love? When we are dumped in love, both chemicals, serotonin and especially dopamine, there is a rapid decline in their level. Those gives the symptoms of feeling blue, feeling sad, and some of us might even slip into chronic depression if low level of those chemicals last for a while. So there is dopamine receptors. I want to tell you a little bit more about dopamine. One structure in the brain known as nucleus accumbens. It's a teeny structure, sits right next to hypothalamus, sometimes also known as pleasure center, and it's loaded with dopamine receptors. So when people take illegal drugs, although different illegal drugs affect different parts of the brain and affect them differently, most drugs have one thing in common. They all hit nucleus accumbens, and nucleus accumbens is loaded with dopamine receptors. So that's what gives you, again, that sense of euphoria, a sense of high. Let me tell you about how link between dopamine and schizophrenia. So what we found about the link between the two, actually we found it by accident, and it started with Parkinson's disease patients. So we found that they have low level of dopamine, Parkinson's disease patient, and if we increase level of dopamine by giving them a chemical that mimics endogenous dopamine, we call it L-DOPA, L-DOPA. So then we bump up level of dopamine for Parkinson's disease patient, and actually that decreases the symptom, the tremors that they have. So we made a mistake in those studies, and Parkinson's disease patient was overdosed with L-DOPA. Surprisingly to everyone, they developed symptoms of schizophrenia. So if you're a researcher, you immediately have a next question in your mind. Could it be that schizophrenics have high level of dopamine, which actually happened to be true? So when we have high level of dopamine, what's happening with our brain, that instead of going by the pathway, the action potential, that the way neurons communicate, should go one way. If you have high level of dopamine, the neurons might misfire, and instead of going this way, it's just going to go to completely random area in your brain. Example, it might go to part of the brain that's responsible for vision and generate action potential. For you right now, if you're listening and see me on the screen, so if you say, I see you, it's mean that there's a corresponding reaction in your occipital lobe in the back of your brain that's responsible for vision. So that part of the brain is stimulated from the outside. You have stimuli outside that you're looking at, and seeing, experience of seeing, take place in the brain. So you might have eyes we have eyes that are necessary to collect the data, but experience of seeing take place not in your eyes. The actual experience of seeing take place in the occipital lobe. So what's happened for schizophrenic patients, if there is that detour, you have too much dopamine, and now all of a sudden your occipital lobe is firing from inside, not from the outside stimulus that come from your eyes. Visual memories are stored in occipital lobe. So when occipital lobe fires, which that's the case in schizophrenic patient, then you have hallucinations. You have visual hallucination. If part of the brain is responsible for auditory information, a little bit of a frontal cortex and temporal lobe over here, if, again, you have high level of dopamine and neurons misfire and pathway leads you to this area, so the area is stimulated from inside and you have auditory hallucination. So interestingly, in psychology, we say now, we call it disorders. Some psychologists, some scientists arguing, and they promoting the notion of human variation. So brain is just like any other organ, could have structural, chemical, and functional abnormalities. So when we have abnormality in our pancreas, so it doesn't release proper level of insulin, and people have diabetes, we are not going to say, well, you just have a diabetes. So we're compassionate, but when people say I have low level of serotonin, I have high level of dopamine, I have structural and functional abnormalities in my brain, there's still stigma attached to those disorders. So what I would like to tell, so again, here's some function of those neurotransmitters. As you can see, dopamine, in addition to sense of joy, euphoria, also responsible for motor functioning. So that leads us to all kind of discoveries, how we can correct those problems. If our biochemical structure is not in the proper, it does not work properly, so we can come up with medications. So in this picture, you can see on top in blue. So the brown is the receptor site, and the blue is an endogenous neurotransmitters, as you can see, like a key in the lock, perfect match. So it means that that neurotransmitter will generate action potential or resting potential. If we have too little of something, like for example serotonin, we can give you a chemical that matches endogenous neurotransmitter pretty closely, for example in pink. So it's not ideal, it's not perfect, but close enough for receptor side to welcome the chemical and also allow that chemical to generate action potential or resting potential, to do exactly what endogenous neurotransmitter will do. If you have too much of something, like for example dopamine in case of schizophrenic patients, we still can have a drug. Now in this case we have antagonist. Antagonist means it's preventing. So it's prevent neuron from generating a normal response. So if you have too much of dopamine, then we have a drug that mimic, that actually not mimic, we have a drug that going to land on a receptor site in green. Receptor site and molecule structure of the chemical that we give you matches close enough for receptor site to say, yeah, come on over and land on me. But it's not close enough to generate corresponding reaction. So it's not doing what normal dopamine, for example, would be doing. In this way, we are regulating the level of chemicals and adjusting, modifying people's emotions and people's behavior. So some of you might be familiar with Prozac, Zoloft. Very often we call them reuptake inhibitors. So those medication, as you can see in red, what they're doing, they're blocking the channel. Remember, we talked about 3 things that could happen to neurotransmitters when they are released in synaptic gap. 1, they dissolve. 2, reuptake, they go back. And number 3, they land on the receptor side. So let's say if you have already low level of serotonin and some of those molecules still want to go back, and we don't want that, we want to correct for that. So Prozac, Zoloft, that's exactly what it's doing. It's blocking that channel so that now you have extra serotonin, your own serotonin, and it can land on the receptor side and produce the response that it's supposed to produce. So now in this slide, it's a little bit overwhelming. You see a variety of different drugs that could act, have an effect at different levels and modify and adjust chemical abnormalities that we have. Back to schizophrenia, I would like to mention what we found with schizophrenia. In addition to high level of dopamine and chemical abnormalities, there are also structural and functional abnormalities within the brain of those patients, so especially in the frontal cortex. So the more you read further on the brain in this chapter, the more you understand the nature of psychological disorders, the nature of our mood, and in general, our experiences as human beings.